This contraption was devised by one of the greatest investigators of the paranormal. Harry Price, that's him over there, wanted to make sure that in seances with the spirits, mediums couldn't cheat. So he wired up their hands and feet. One false move and caught in the act. Tonight we'll be telling the story of Harry Price's biggest job, the case of the most haunted house in England and how some claim it's still going on. We'll interview witnesses and reconstruct what they say they heard and saw. Do you believe in life after death? Some people not only believe, they say they know it exists. They're the 1 in 4 people who, after traumatic accidents, operations or cardiac resuscitation, all describe the same thing: dying and coming back to life, and in between, glimpsing a world beyond. Now, what have become known as near-death experiences were recorded long ago in the ancient Egyptian and Tibetan books of the dead, and by the Greek philosopher Plato too, but they cross all cultural boundaries. They can't, of course, be proved, however sincerely they're reported, but what can be proved is that those involved have had a close brush with death.
He was pretty close to death because he had severe hypothermia, he had severe injuries. On the records, he had multiple fracture in the pelvis, a fracture in the left wrist, fracture in the left leg, and multiple fractures in the jaw bones, and also multiple fractures in the ribs.
I was so shocked that I couldn't recognise it as my husband. I looked at this person lying on the bed and I thought, no, that's not my husband. Doesn't look anything like him. He had this life support machine, breathing.
Oh, Ron.
I think we'll have to get the hose pipe out there.
Yes, I think it's...
Ron Bell had already survived 2 heart attacks. After the second one, he had to give up work and became virtually housebound. Upset and frustrated, he became impossible for his family to live with.
So I sort of decided to split up. We split up and I took 2 of the children and left 2 with him.
The situation with my parents, my mum, splitting up with my mum at the time, coping with looking after me. I think a lot of things had got him down. He was quite depressed.
But Ron's health was improving. One of his sons was about to get married, and he'd begun to get out and about again. One evening, he set off for a walk at Old Hartley on the Tyneside coast, a favourite spot of his. A friend dropped him off.
Are you sure you're going to be all right?
Yeah, I'll be all right. I'll have a good walk. I'll see you later.
I went down to Hartley because it's a peaceful place. It's a lovely place. I needed time to think, to sort things out. It's a place where I always go, and I just like it. It's my place. I was feeling really good. I was walking along the cliff top path, and it was a cold night. I could hear the waves beating on the rocks below, and I got this excruciating pain come to my chest. Having had 2 heart attacks before, I realised I was probably taking a heart attack. And it just bowled me over, and I found myself over the cliff edge.
The cliffs at Old Hartley are a sheer drop of 60 feet. There was no fence, nothing to save Ron.
The coastline here is fairly dangerous. The cliff is unstable. Anyone getting too close to the cliff edge is taking the chance that the edge will crumble. Clearly, falling from that height, anybody surviving would have to count themselves fairly lucky.
Ron was one of the lucky ones. Though he'd bounced on the rocks several times and suffered appalling injuries, he was still alive, but only just.
I was in the sea, and I couldn't move. Nothing would move. So I must have lost consciousness again. And when I came to, I was further out to sea. And thought I was probably going to die. And I called out my wife's name and my children's name and names. And just more or less resigned myself to wait. Suddenly I felt warm and at peace. Then it just seemed to happen. I found myself in this tunnel with a very bright light at the end of it, and I was walking towards it. At the end of the tunnel, when I arrived there was a bridge. At the far end, there was human shapes, shadows, and I said,
I'm coming across.
The arms were beckoning me, and a voice in my head said, you can't cross the bridge. It's not your time yet. Then suddenly I was rushing backwards, away from the bridge, away from the shadows.
It wasn't until the next morning that a passer-by walking his dog on a beach found Ron in shallow water. He called an ambulance.
Hypothermia is the danger. That time of year when the sea temperature's about 6 or 7 degrees Celsius. Half an hour is a good survival time, and the average person probably wouldn't survive much more than 2.5 hours in the water.
Ron was in the water for 14 hours, but amazingly, when the ambulance crew got to him, there was a glimmer of life.
Breathing. Got a weak pulse. Scoop him out, okay?
When he arrived at the hospital, Ron was clearly in a critical condition, made even more serious by his medical history.
He had a heart attack in the past, and he was in extremely poor state. He had extensive injuries practically in the whole body. His chance of survival was pretty poor, and similarly the chances for leading a normal life was extremely poor as well.
But had Ron Bell really been at death's door? Did he literally come back to life? And if he did, what did he go through? Dr. Peter Fenwick of the Institute of Psychiatry studies altered states of consciousness in the brain. Ron Bell's case is one of 400 near-death experiences, or NDEs, which he's collected.
Do people make up stories about NDEs? No, I don't think they do. My reason for saying this is that there is a very clear set of features. If you haven't had the experience, it's very difficult to get it right.
Dr. Fenwick argues that because the accounts of Ron Bell and others are so similar, they must be real. But Dr. Susan Blackmore of the West of England University disagrees. She's been investigating near-death experiences for 20 years after having one herself.
I'm convinced that it isn't because we all go to another world, but it's because of what's happening in the brain. Because near death or under stress, there's kind of random firing of all the cells going on in the brain. It could be lack of oxygen, which disturbs the balance of firing, or it could be the brain's own morphine-like chemicals that is experienced as lights, tunnels, hallucinations, and feelings of presence. So I now believe not that the experiences are all the same because we all have a soul or spirit that goes to heaven, but they're all the same because we all have similar brains.
So, the imagination of a dying brain, or as Dr. Fenwick believes, the mind leaving the body to go elsewhere.
It's that the brain isn't functioning. It's not there. It's destroyed. It's abnormal, but yet it can produce these very clear experiences.
I thought I died. I honestly thought I died.
God, you're back.
Ron's nurse hadn't expected him to recover. When he did, she remembers clearly what he described to her.
I was very pleased and surprised that he'd recovered. He told me of a dream that he'd had about the tunnel and the shapes and the light, and he was going towards it. It was very convincing, and other patients have told me of the same dream and experience they've had when they've been in that state.
As Ron Bell was to discover, there's something else which those who claim near-death experiences usually find.
Most people lose their fear of death. A lot of people feel that they have a mission that they have to go through. There's something for them to do in this life. And many people are more social. That is, they think more about their friends.
My father was probably quite a selfish person. rather inconsiderate. He never had a great deal of time for us when we were children. He was around, but never for us. Since the accident, I think he's definitely become more responsible towards his family.
The experience also brought about a reconciliation with his wife. They decided to give their marriage another try. Ron's son Robert got married too. After the ceremony, the couple visited him in hospital.
I think he's got more of a sanctity for life. He's got more of a, what would you say, a zest for life, really. He's a lot more of a caring person than he was.
I realised that I'd been given another chance, but if I was to die tomorrow, I would not be afraid. I'm not afraid of death. This is where we'll all go, eventually. I know because I've been there.
Near-death experiences are being taken so seriously that tests are now being carried out in the cardiac units of hospitals around southern England. Objects are being hidden high out of patients' view, and if those who've been near death can later describe the objects, it follows they must have left their bodies. It lasted for decades. It became a national legend, and investigating it was the case of a lifetime for Harry Price, Ghostbuster Supreme. Borley Rectory, in the tiny East Anglian hamlet whose name it bears, was once known as the most haunted house in England. Many people, 5 successive rectors, their wives and families, neighbours and visitors, all apparently saw things there. And the legend lives on.
I've been involved with Borley for over 40 years, 27 years as editor of the local paper. And in every year of those 40 years, something has been reported as happening at Borley. There's nothing there, there's no shop, there's no pub. In fact, the last place that you'd expect to see a stream of visitors.
So how and why has the quiet of the English countryside been so disrupted? Ever since Borley Rectory was built in 1863, reports have abounded of strange whisperings, a ghostly presence, and mysterious so-called accidents. It all began with the daughters of the first vicar, and a truly haunting vision. At the end of the garden, they saw a figure, its head bowed as if in prayer. One of the sisters stepped forward, but as she did, it seemed to vanish into thin air. Peter Underwood, who's been investigating Borley for 40 years, recalls meeting the sisters.
They were much travelled and intelligent and educated people. They weren't fools, and they certainly wouldn't lower themselves to make stories up to impress other people.
The legend established, claims continued of strange happenings at Borley Rectory. 2 decades later, it was the turn of the Reverend Eric Smith and his wife. They described more voices, footsteps, and servant bells ringing of their own accord. Then, while tidying a cupboard, Mrs. Smith made a gruesome discovery. Wrapped in brown paper, a skull. Beginning to doubt their sanity, the Smiths asked a national newspaper to investigate.
This story could run and run. It seems everyone round here has seen or heard of something. Harry Price? You mean the psychic expert?
The newspaper called in the ghost-busting services of Harry Price.
Reverend Smith and Mrs. Smith.
Howdy.
Harry was a former engineer whose marriage to a rich wife meant he could spend his time and her money delving into the paranormal. Mostly he set out to expose psychic frauds. But were the events the Smiths described a fraud?
And you see, you cut the wires and the bells still ring.
Yes, we just...
If he had any doubts about Borley, Harry Price soon experienced strange events at first hand.
Did you see that?
It came from upstairs, but there's no one there.
Harry and the reporter had a narrow escape from a flying candlestick. But there was something of the showman in Harry Price too. He left his paranormal collection to London University. Alan Wesencraft, who looks after it, met the man himself.
I think Harry Price's enthusiasm did lead him into making exaggerated claims. He's had a fertile imagination, and this would take charge, I suppose.
Harry Price told his story to the world, but the Smiths had had enough. They moved out. Several vicars turned down the job before a new one could be found. The Reverend Lionel Algernon Foyster was old enough to be the father of his wife, Marianne.
Lovely day, and the lavender looks beautiful.
Yes, it is a nice day, isn't it? Quite quiet round here after London, though, don't you find?
Life in this backwater was hardly her style, but the paranormal events were.
The poor girl really craved something a little bit more exciting, and she found the excitement, I think, by playing up the idea of the haunts.
Lionel, look at this.
What is it, dear?
Pebbles under my pillow. How on earth did they get there? You must write this up in your diary.
Suspicions that the old vicar was fooled by his wife might have been justified.
First my collar, which I'd taken off for comfort, is thrown at me. Then a stick, and a piece of coal thrown across the room.
But what about the testimony of independent witnesses? A local headmaster and magistrate, Guy Lestrange, wrote about taking tea with the Foysters.
The other day, the servants' bells started to ring all on their own.
What was that?
Jumping up, I hurried to the door and found the floor outside littered with broken crockery.
It's starting to happen all over again.
Mary! Yes, well, you see, you can never tell what's going to happen in this house. Let's finish our tea while our cups are still intact.
Still not fully convinced, the magistrate returned to his seat. No sooner had he done so,
an appalling series of crashes took us back to the doorway.
And this time, Guy Lestrange couldn't believe his eyes.
Bottles were being hurled about in all directions in the hall, though nobody could be seen throwing them.
Good God.
When the Foysters left, Harry Price's big moment arrived. He took a year's lease on the rectory and moved in. He placed an advertisement in the Times, inviting people of leisure and intellect to assist in his investigation. Charles Wintour, later a distinguished newspaper editor, was one of those who took up the invitation.
I went to Borley Rectory with an entirely open mind. I was just curious what was happening there. I was convinced that Harry Price was egging it up a bit. There was something occurring, but he was making it more so.
Far better prospect. Let's have a look. Yes, this looks interesting. I think you can seal this one up. You know what.
In order to make certain that nobody was interfering with the house, we would place cotton thread across the doors and across the passages so that nobody could sneak up.
When they returned, they found the seals intact. But on inspecting the rooms, Charles Wintour and his friend found marks had appeared on the walls, scratches and indecipherable messages.
On one occasion, I thought one of the pencil marks was actually moving as I saw it. It seems mad, but I think that's what I saw at the time.
Harry Price reaped the rewards of his research. His findings were published in best-selling books. Borley Rectory became famous as the most haunted house in England. Until one night, there was a fire. The rectory was reduced to a ruin. Arson was suspected but could never be proved. With the rectory gone, the haunting was thought to be over. In any case, for many, Harry Price's exaggerations and Marianne Foyster's confessions, made to investigators like Peter Underwood, had discredited the story. But was there still more to it?
There were things going on at Borley long before Marianne went there. There were things going on at Borley long before Harry Price went there. And there were things happening at Borley long after Marianne left and long after Harry Price was dead.
The new vicar buried bones found during the rectory demolition and began to claim new happenings across the road at Borley Church itself.
He was the one more than anyone else who moved the ghost from one side of the road to the other. He was the man who said, you know, that strange things are happening in my church. I've seen things in my church. I've heard things in my church. And because he was the vicar or the rector, people believed him.
It's in the medieval church that Ron Russell and other psychic investigators have continued Harry Price's work. One night, he and a small team set up tape recorders there.
To our surprise, we received a series of strange, unaccountable noises on the tapes. I've no doubt in my own mind that these sounds were paranormal.
And the stories of unexplained incidents continue.
Just heard what sounded like an organ playing from inside the church. But as we went in the church, it suddenly stopped. To our utter amazement, there was not a soul in the church. The organ console was closed and padlocked.
Once we were inside the church, we carried on looking round when I was aware of the sound of pebbles falling down on the ground. I looked, but I couldn't actually see any pebbles.
Like all the other claims surrounding Borley over the years, there is an explanation, but an incomplete one.
Some local boys confessed that they'd been hiding in the church. One had pumped the organ up and the other had played a few bars, and they then died behind the pews. Since then, in recent times, the church has been locked, and still people are saying they're hearing the organ. What do you make of that? I don't know.
Harry Price died 9 years after Borley Rectory was destroyed. Almost immediately, books were published tearing his work to shreds. But expert opinion is divided. Though they agree his claims were exaggerated, many still back him. And to this day, a special library is dedicated to him at London University. And of course, Harry, wherever he is now, can't be accused of interfering in events since his death. At least not if he's sitting in one of these. Good night.